She had only 37,042s left when she bought the house everyone in St. Morwin was afraid to enter. The villagers laughed when they heard. They called Florence Hale desperate. Some called her foolish. One man told her she would be dead before winter. What they didn't know was that the abandoned estate they had spent 30 years avoiding was hiding something worth a fortune, and somewhere behind its sealed eastern walls was the answer to a death the village had agreed never to discuss again. Florence didn't know any of that when she arrived. She only knew she had nowhere else to go. The coach rolled into St. Morwin on a wet November afternoon, its wheels splashing through muddy water as Florence stepped onto the cold stone street. She was 20 years old. Her black mourning dress had faded at the elbows, and the small leather bag hanging from her wrist contained nearly everything she owned. Her father had died 4 weeks earlier. He had been a country rector with more books than money, and his final years had been spent trying to keep the parish school open. After his funeral, Florence discovered just how little he had been able to leave her. A few personal belongings, some unpaid household bills, and 112.19. That money disappeared quickly. A room at the Salt Dog Inn, food, coal, a train ticket she never used because she couldn't afford another journey. 7 days later, Florence sat alone at a wooden table and counted what remained. £37.42. She stared at the coins for a long time. Then someone behind her mentioned Blackwood Manor. Florence looked up. 2 fishermen were talking quietly near the fireplace. Nobody's living there. Nobody has for years. Arthur Blackwood sealed the east wing himself. The second fisherman lowered his voice. After his brother died. The room went quiet. Florence turned toward the innkeeper. What happened? Ned to him. The old man's expression changed. You'd best leave that story alone. Why? Because some places remember. A nervous laugh came from one of the fishermen. The innkeeper didn't laugh. He told Florence about Blackwood Manor, a massive stone estate overlooking the cliffs, abandoned for more than 30 years. Its roof was collapsing. Its gardens had become wilderness, and the eastern wing had remained locked since Edward Blackwood's mysterious death. Nobody wanted the property, not even the solicitor who had acquired it after years of unpaid taxes. Florence should have forgotten about it. Instead, she asked one question. How much? The next morning, she walked to Mr. Finch's office. He laughed when she told him what she wanted. Blackwood Manor? He looked at her worn boots. Miss Hale, you have exactly enough money to buy it. Florence frowned. How much? 37.42. He expected her to walk away. She didn't. She signed the papers. By sunset, Florence Hale owned the cursed estate, and the people who laughed at her had no idea she had just purchased the one place in St. Morwin where someone had hidden the truth. Florence had not planned to stay in Cornwall. 3 weeks earlier, she had believed she would return home after her father's funeral, find work somewhere nearby, and somehow rebuild the quiet life they had shared. That plan disappeared with the house. The new rector needed the parish residence for his family, and Florence had no legal claim to remain there. She packed her father's books into one small trunk, folded his final letter into her coat pocket, and left before anyone could see how frightened she was. Her father had written the letter 2 days before his death. There was only one unusual line. If you have nowhere else to go, look toward the coast. Someone there may remember the Hale family. Florence had followed that advice. Nobody remembered. The distant cousin her father had mentioned had left for America nearly 12 years earlier. The people she asked at the harbor knew the name Hale, but only vaguely. One elderly fisherman finally said, "Your father once helped my boy learn to read." Then he looked away. That was all Florence had inherited from her father's good name. A few people remembered his kindness. Nobody could give her a home. At the Salt Dog Inn, her situation became impossible to hide. "You owe for 2 more nights," Mrs. Pritchard, the innkeeper's wife, told her one morning. Florence placed 3 coins on the counter. "I can pay for one." Mrs. Pritchard looked at the coins, then at Florence. "Where will you go after that?" "I don't know." It was the first time Florence had admitted it aloud. That afternoon, she took her father's letter from her pocket and read it again. The paper was soft from being folded so many times. At the bottom, beneath his signature, was another sentence she hadn't noticed before. "Your mother once told me that the Blackwoods owed our family a debt." Florence froze. Blackwoods. The name threw on the inn. She went back to the common room and asked about the family. Nobody wanted to answer. But eventually she learned that Blackwood Manor had once been the largest estate along that stretch of coast. Edward Blackwood had been a respected businessman. His younger brother Arthur had inherited the property after Edward's death. Then, something happened. Arthur sealed the eastern wing. Within a year, he disappeared from Cornwall. The estate deteriorated, and the village stopped asking questions. Florence spent that night awake. By morning, she had made her decision. If the manor could shelter her, even temporarily, she would take the risk. She found Mr. Finch after breakfast. He listened without interrupting. Then he produced the deed. $37.42. Florence counted her money, every last coin. Sold. The solicitor watched her sign. When she stood to leave, he finally spoke. "Miss Hale." She turned. "If you hear footsteps in the east wing, don't investigate." Florence stared at him. "Why?" Mr. Finch looked toward the locked office door behind him. "Because some things were hidden there for a reason." Florence folded the deed and slipped it into her coat. For the first time, she wondered whether her father had sent her to Cornwall because he knew exactly what was waiting for her. The road to Blackwood Manor narrowed until it was barely more than 2 muddy tracks between overgrown hedges. Florence sat beside the driver, holding her father's trunk steady whenever the cart struck a rut. The driver, John Carter, had agreed to take her there for $2 and a promise that she would not blame him if he refused to return. "People don't stay at Blackwood," he said. Florence looked toward the dark hills. "Maybe people haven't had my reasons." John gave a short grunt. "That's one way of looking at it." They traveled another mile before the trees opened. Florence saw the manor. It stood alone on a rise above the sea, enormous and grey beneath the November sky. The roof had partially collapsed. Ivy covered one side of the building. Several windows were broken, and the gardens had disappeared beneath weeds and thorn bushes. It looked less abandoned than forgotten. John stopped the cart. "That's your new home." Florence stepped down. For several seconds, she simply stared. The place was terrible, but it was hers. She walked toward the front door with the large iron key Mr. Finch had given her. The lock resisted. She pushed harder. With a deep metallic click, the door opened. Cold air rolled through the entrance hall. Inside, everything smelled of damp wood, dust, and old stone. Furniture stood beneath white sheets. A grandfather clock had stopped at 2:17. Portraits hung crookedly along the walls, their faces dark beneath years of grime. Florence found the kitchen and began clearing a small space near the fireplace. John helped her bring in the trunk. Before leaving, he hesitated at the doorway. "My grandfather worked here." Florence looked up. "As a groundskeeper?" John nodded. "He used to say Mr. Edward Blackwood was a decent man." "Did he say how Edward died?" John's expression tightened. "No. You know something." "Hark. I know enough to keep my mouth shut." He picked up his hat. Then he added quietly, If you hear knocking from inside the east wing, don't answer it. Florence almost smiled. You've all told me the same thing. John didn't smile back. That's because we've all heard it. He left before she could ask another question. That night, Florence slept beside the kitchen fireplace with her father's coat wrapped around her shoulders. The wind pushed against the windows. The old house groaned around her. For the first time since her father's death, she cried. Not loudly, just quietly, with her face pressed into the sleeve of his coat. At dawn, she began cleaning. She found enough coal for 2 fires, a rusted kettle, several cracked plates, and a pantry containing nothing but flour crawling with insects. It was going to be difficult, but difficult was better than homeless. By afternoon, Florence had cleared a narrow path through the main hall. That was when she noticed something strange. A cold draft touched her ankle. She stopped. The windows were closed. The doors were shut. Yet the air was moving. Florence followed it to the northern wall. She placed her palm against the stone. Cold. Then she noticed a thin line between 2 floorboards directly beneath it. One board was newer than the others. Someone had replaced it. Florence stared at it for a long moment. The house had been abandoned for 30 years. So who had repaired that floor? Florence left the strange floorboard alone for 2 days. She had more immediate problems. The roof leaked above the kitchen. The fireplace smoked whenever the wind came from the sea. She had $18 left, and nearly 4 of those would disappear the next time she went into the village for food. So she worked. She patched holes with cloth, carried water from the old well, and cleared enough of the kitchen garden to plant vegetables before winter. But every evening, her eyes returned to that floorboard. It was the only repaired thing in the entire northern wall. On the 3rd morning, Florence finally decided to investigate. She knelt with a kitchen knife and worked the blade into the narrow seam. Nothing. She tried again. The wood lifted less than an inch before stopping against something underneath. Florence frowned. There was something below it. She fetched a small iron poker from the fireplace and tried again. This time, the board shifted. A tiny brass key slid from beneath it and landed against the stone floor. Florence stared. The key was old but strangely clean. Someone had hidden it recently enough to keep the metal from turning completely black. She picked it up. There was a number scratched into its surface. 17. That meant nothing to her. Then she noticed something else. Carved into the underside of the floorboard was a small symbol, a circle crossed by 2 lines. Florence had seen it before. It appeared on the corner of one of her father's old books. She rushed to her trunk. For several minutes she searched through his belongings until she found the book. It was an old volume about Cornish land records. She opened the cover. There, pressed faintly into the leather, was the same symbol. Florence sat down. Her father's final letter suddenly felt heavier in her hand. The Blackwoods owed our family a debt. She had assumed it was an old family grievance. Now she wasn't so sure. That afternoon, Florence carried the key into the village. She showed it to John Carter. The old farmer studied it without touching it. "Where did you find this?" "Under the floor." John's face changed. "Which floor?" "The northern hall." He stood very still. "What? Who told you to look there?" "Nobody." John rubbed his jaw. Then he shook his head. "You shouldn't have found that." Florence stepped closer. "Why?" John looked toward the road before answering. "My grandfather used to say Edward Blackwood kept records nobody else was allowed to see." "What records?" "I don't know." "You do." John sighed. "Maybe I know where he kept them." Florence waited. But John only handed the key back. "Go home before dark." "Why?" His eyes settled on the number scratched into the metal. Because 17 wasn't a room number. Florence felt a chill move through her. What was it? John looked at her. It was the number of the last ledger Edward Blackwood ever wrote. He walked away. Florence remained in the road, the tiny brass key closed inside her fist. For the first time, she understood something that frightened her more than the stories about ghosts. Someone had hidden this key. Someone had hidden it carefully, and someone might have expected the right person to find it. The next morning, someone was waiting outside Blackwood Manor. Florence saw the man through the kitchen window. He stood beside a polished black carriage, completely out of place among the weeds, broken stone, and collapsing walls. It was Squire Edwin Trelane. He had come alone. Florence opened the door but remained on the threshold. "You've settled in quickly," Trelane said. "Not by choice." His eyes moved across the ruined hall. "You could sell." "I bought it yesterday." "I know." That answer made Florence pause. Trelane removed a folded paper from his coat. $45,000. Florence stared at him. "For this?" "For the land." He tapped the document. "I'll give you $45,000 cash, provided you sign today." Florence almost laughed. Yesterday, everyone had told her the property was worthless. Now someone was offering more money than she could have imagined. "Why?" Trelane's expression hardened. "I need the property cleared before January." "Why?" "I have an agreement with a construction company. They are planning a coastal road through the lower fields. The contract expires in 6 weeks. Florence understood. If Trelane didn't control Blackwood Manor, the project couldn't proceed. "You need my land. I need you to be sensible." He placed the offer on the table. Florence looked at the number again. $45,000. It could buy her a house. It could pay every debt her father had left. She could leave St. Morwin forever. For several seconds, she imagined it. Then she remembered the brass key, number 17, and her father's symbol. "No." Trelane's face changed. "You don't understand what you're refusing. I understand $45,000. And I also understand that you came here the morning after I bought a supposedly worthless property." Silence. Florence folded her arms. "That seems strange." Trelane stepped closer. "You are young. You have no experience with property. You don't know what you're dealing with. Then perhaps you should explain." "I've said enough." He turned toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped. "Burning roofs can be repaired." Florence frowned. "What does that mean?" Trelane looked back at her. "It means accidents happen in old houses." Then he walked away. That night, Florence couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the offer. $45,000. Why would a man risk that much for land he had called worthless? At midnight, she heard a sound downstairs, a slow scrape. Then another. Florence sat upright. Moss, the stray dog John had left with her earlier that evening, lifted his head and growled. Someone was inside the house. Florence reached for the fireplace poker. The footsteps stopped. Then came 3 quiet knocks. Not at the front door, from behind the northern wall. Florence froze. The brass key in her pocket seemed suddenly heavier. And from somewhere beyond the sealed east wing came a sound that made her blood run cold. A man's voice. Barely audible. 70. Florence did not move. The voice beyond the wall had been so faint that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Then Moss growled again. This time, from somewhere near the kitchen doorway came the unmistakable sound of a boot scraping across stone. Someone was in the house. Florence tightened her grip on the fireplace poker. "Who's there?" No answer. She stepped into the hall. Moonlight slipped through the broken windows, barely illuminating the furniture beneath its dusty sheets. Nothing moved. Then she noticed the front door. It was open. Florence had locked it before going upstairs. She crossed the hall slowly. The rain had blown leaves across the floor. Beside them was a muddy footprint. A man's boot. She followed the tracks. They stopped at the northern wall. Florence stared at the floorboard, the same one she had opened 2 days earlier. Someone else had been looking for the key. She immediately ran upstairs and checked her father's trunk. The brass key was still there. So was the deed. But something was missing. Her father's final letter. Florence searched the trunk again. Nothing. Her hands began to shake. She remembered reading it beside the fire. She remembered folding it and placing it inside the inner pocket of her coat. She checked the coat. Empty. Someone had taken it. The next morning, Florence went straight to John Carter. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he removed his cap and rubbed his forehead. "I told you to leave." "Someone entered my house." "I know." Florence stared at him. "You know?" John looked away. "My grandfather wasn't the only man who knew about the East Wing." "Who else?" John hesitated. Then he said, "Trelane's father." Florence felt the pieces shift. "What did he know?" "Enough to be afraid of Edward Blackwood." "Afraid of what?" John shook his head. "I don't know." "But you know something." The old farmer sighed. "Edward wasn't killed because of an argument over family money." Florence stepped closer. "Then why?" John looked toward the manor on the distant hill. "Because Edward discovered something." "What?" "I never learned." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "I found this after my grandfather died. He told me never to open it unless someone started asking questions about Blackwood again." Florence took it. Her name was written across the front, not John's. Hers. Florence stared at the handwriting. She recognized it immediately. It was her father's. Inside was a single sentence. "If they offer you money, don't take it. They already know you found the door." Florence read it twice. Then she looked at John. "What door?" John's face had gone pale. "The one your father was looking for." That afternoon, Florence returned to Blackwood Manor. She carried the brass key in one hand and her father's note in the other. The number 17 suddenly made sense. Not a ledger, not a room, a door. And somewhere inside the ruined estate was a door her father had known about before he died. Florence returned to Blackwood Manor before sunset. The house looked different now. Not because anything had changed, but because she finally understood that someone had been hiding something inside it. She went straight to the northern wall. The brass key was marked 17. Florence ran her fingers along the stone, searching for anything that looked out of place. Nothing. Then moss began scratching at the floor. Florence followed him to the same repaired board. She pried it loose again. Beneath it was the narrow cavity where she had found the key. But this time she noticed a second detail. At the back of the opening was a small iron plate, 7 inches wide, and carved into it was the same circle and 2-line symbol from her father's book. Florence inserted the brass key. It turned. Something clicked deep inside the wall. A section of stone shifted backward. Florence stepped away. The wall had opened. Behind it was a narrow passage descending into darkness. She lit a candle. Moss refused to follow. Florence understood why. The passage smelled of damp earth and something older like paper that had been sealed away for decades. She descended 12 steps, At the bottom was a small chamber. There was a wooden desk, a rusted lamp, 3 shelves, and a locked iron box. Florence approached the desk first. Dust covered everything except one object, a photograph. She picked it up. It showed 2 young men standing outside Blackwood Manor. Edward Blackwood stood on the left. Arthur stood beside him. But there was a third person in the photograph. A woman. Florence stared at her face. She knew her. It was her mother. Florence's breath caught. Her mother had never mentioned Blackwood Manor. Not once. She turned the photograph over. Written on the back were 4 words. She knew about 17. Florence sat down hard. For some virile moments, she couldn't move. Then she opened the iron box. Inside were bank statements, property deeds, handwritten accounts, and a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. The first letter was dated 1891. The second was from Edward. The third carried her mother's name. Florence unfolded it. Only 1 paragraph had been written. If anything happens to me, give this to Margaret Hale. She must know what Arthur has done. Florence read the sentence again. Arthur. Her mother's name. And the same secret her father had apparently spent his final days investigating. Then she noticed something beneath the letters. A bank certificate. The amount printed across the top made her forget how to breathe. £2,840,000. Florence stared at the number. She had entered the chamber expecting an old secret. She had found evidence of a fortune. But beneath the certificate was another document. A death record. Edward Blackwood's death had been recorded as natural causes. The signature belonged to Arthur Blackwood. Florence's fingers tightened around the paper. The man who had inherited everything had also signed the document declaring his brother dead. And suddenly the fortune was no longer the most frightening thing in the room. The question was, why had Florence's mother known about it? Florence spent the night sitting on the floor of the hidden chamber. The number on the bank certificate kept returning to her mind, $2,940,000. It was more money than she could comprehend. But the photograph troubled her more. Her mother had stood beside Edward Blackwood. She had known about the hidden room, and somehow, before her death, she had passed that secret to Florence's father. Florence untied the bundle of letters. Most were written by Edward. They described missing money, altered property records, and payments made to people in St. Morwin. Then she found an envelope that made her hands go cold. Her name was written across it. Florence. The handwriting belonged to her father. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter dated 6 months before his death. My dear Florence, if you are reading this, then I was unable to finish what I started. I never wanted you involved. Your mother knew about Blackwood Manor before you were born. She believed Edward Blackwood was murdered, but she never had enough evidence to prove it. After she died, I found the first record. I spent years trying to understand why Arthur Blackwood had transferred portions of the estate into accounts that did not exist publicly. The answer is in this house. The money was never stolen from Edward. It was hidden by him. He knew his brother intended to take control of everything, and he prepared a way to protect it. But Edward also discovered something far more dangerous. Arthur had been using the family land to hide payments made to several men in St. Morwin. Men who later helped convince everyone that Edward's death was natural. Your mother believed one of those men was still alive when she died. I believe she was right. If you ever reach Blackwood Manor, do not trust anyone who tells you the house is worthless. And if they offer you money to leave, refuse. Your mother spent her final years believing the truth would eventually surface. Perhaps it will be you who finally brings it into the light. Florence lowered the letter. For the first time, her father's final decision made sense. He hadn't sent her to Cornwall because he had nowhere else to send her. He had sent her because he believed she might one day find what he couldn't. Florence wiped her eyes. Then she noticed something written beneath the final paragraph. A name. Edwin Trelane. Her stomach tightened. The same man who had offered her $45,000, the same man whose father had been connected to Arthur Blackwood. Florence looked at the bank certificate again. The fortune wasn't simply hidden money, it was evidence. And if her father was right, Trelane's family had spent decades making sure nobody found it. A sound came from above. Footsteps. Florence extinguished the candle. Someone was walking through the manor. She held her breath. The footsteps stopped directly over the hidden chamber. Then came a heavy impact. Once, twice. Someone was searching the floor. Florence closed her hand around the letter. Whoever was upstairs wasn't looking for the money. They were looking for her father's evidence. And suddenly she understood why Trelane had been so desperate to buy Blackwood Manor. By sunrise, Florence had made her decision. She would not run. She would make Trelane explain why he had been so desperate to buy a worthless house. At 10 o'clock, she walked into the village hall carrying the photograph, the bank certificate, her father's letter, and the original Blackwood records. Trelane was already there. So were nearly 30 villagers. He looked confident. "You've caused quite a commotion, Miss Hale." Florence placed the documents on the table. "I think your family has caused it." The room went silent. Trelane's face tightened. "What are you suggesting?" Florence held up the photograph. "My mother knew Edward Blackwood." Several people began whispering. Trelane stepped forward. "That proves nothing." "No." Florence placed the death record beside it. "But this might." She pointed to Arthur Blackwood's signature. "Your grandfather helped him." Trelane's confidence disappeared. Florence continued before he could interrupt. "Edward Blackwood didn't die of natural causes. His brother signed the death record, then transferred millions of dollars through accounts hidden from the public." She placed the bank certificate on the table. $2,840,000. Someone gasped. Trelane stared at the document. "Where did you get that?" Florence looked directly at him. "From the room your family spent 30 years pretending didn't exist." The solicitor, Mr. Finch, had arrived by then. He examined the records carefully. Then he looked at Trelane. "These signatures will need to be verified." Trelane shook his head. "This is ridiculous." "Then you won't object to an investigation." He said nothing. Florence turned to the villagers. "Your families were told Edward was a sick man who died alone. My father discovered evidence that he was murdered because he knew where the money was hidden." An elderly woman near the back began crying. "Oh." "My grandfather worked for Arthur," she whispered. "He always said Edward didn't die naturally." Trelane turned toward her. "Be quiet." Florence heard it. So did everyone else. That single command changed the room. For decades, fear had kept the story buried. Now people were speaking. One after another, old memories surfaced. A missing ledger, a payment, a locked carriage, a man seen leaving Blackwood Manor the night Edward died. Piece by piece, the silence began to collapse. Trelane tried to leave. 2 constables stopped him at the door. The investigation that followed lasted months. Arthur Blackwood's records were authenticated. The hidden fortune was traced, and the evidence surrounding Edward's death was finally placed before the authorities. Florence did not receive the entire $2.84 million immediately. There were claims, legal proceedings, and questions of ownership. But one thing was certain. Blackwood Manor was no longer worthless. Neither was Florence. Months earlier, Trelane had laughed while she stood in that same village square with $37.42 to her name. Now she stood there holding the legal documents proving that the property he desperately wanted belonged to her. He had tried to buy her silence. Instead, he had paid for the truth to be uncovered. Blackwood Manor did not become beautiful overnight. For months, Florence lived among scaffolding, dust, broken windows, and the constant noise of hammers. The roof was repaired first, then the eastern wing, then the kitchen. She could have sold everything. The fortune recovered from Edward Blackwood's hidden accounts was enough to give Florence a life she had never imagined. But she kept the manor. She kept the library exactly where it had been found, including Edward's desk and the photograph of her mother. And she did something nobody in St. Morwin expected. She opened the house. The first room became a small reading room for village children. Another became a classroom. The abandoned gardens were cleared and replanted. The Miller family, who had once struggled to keep their farm, received enough help to buy their land outright. Florence also paid for repairs to the village school. She never spoke publicly about the fortune. She didn't need to. Everyone already knew. Years later, people would still remember the morning she arrived in St. Morwin with a worn suitcase and $37.42. They remembered the laughter. They remembered Trelane calling Blackwood Manor worthless. And they remembered how quiet the village became when the truth finally came out. Florence kept one thing from her old life above the fireplace in the restored library: her father's final letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but she could still read his handwriting. Perhaps it will be you who finally brings it into the light. Every winter, when the sea winds rattled the windows, Florence would sit in that room after everyone else had gone home. Sometimes she would look toward the eastern wing. The place no longer frightened her. It was simply a room now. A room that had once held a terrible secret. A room where her mother had once stood. A room that had eventually led Florence back to the family she thought she had lost forever. One evening, years after the restoration, a little girl sat beside Florence at the library table. "Is it true?" the child asked. "Is what true? That this house was cursed?" Florence smiled. She looked toward the tall windows. Beyond them, the sea was turning silver beneath the setting sun. "No," she said. "The house wasn't cursed." The girl waited. Florence closed her father's letter. It was waiting for someone to tell the truth. Outside, the old village carried on as it always had. But Blackwood Manor was no longer dark. Warm light filled its windows. Children's voices traveled through its halls. And above the fireplace, beneath the photograph of Edward Blackwood and Florence's mother, one small brass key remained on display. Number 17. The key that had opened a hidden door. The door that had uncovered a fortune. And the secret that had finally given Florence something money never could. A place that was truly hers.